The morning my stepfather walked into my office at First National Bank, I almost didn't recognize him. A decade had taken its toll. His once dark hair was now a harsh steel gray, and the confident stride I remembered was replaced by a jittery shuffle. "I need to speak with the loan officer," he told my secretary, his gaze never lifting from the floor as he avoided looking at me behind the desk. "It's about the Harrison manufacturing application." "You're speaking to her," I replied, watching him freeze at the sound of my voice. "Hello, Robert." His face drained of color, and it took a moment before he slowly turned to face me, recognition dawning. "Alexandra. Please, take a seat." I gestured to the chair across from me, savoring the way his hands trembled as he lowered himself into it. "I understand you're here for a loan." "I am Alexandra Chen, and 10 years ago, Robert Harrison took everything from me. My mother's sudden death in a car accident had left me orphaned at 18. The inheritance meant to cover my college tuition and help me start my life had vanished in the weeks following her funeral." "There's been some mistake," Robert stammered, clutching his briefcase like it might shield him. "I need to speak with someone in charge." I smiled, smooth as glass. "As chief lending officer, I assure you, I am in charge here." I pulled out his loan application, noting how his eyes widened as he caught sight of his company's disastrous financials. Now, about Harrison Manufacturing's current predicament. What Robert didn't know, and what no one at the bank knew, was that I hadn't just survived his betrayal, I had thrived. After he'd thrown me out, claiming my mother's will left everything to him, I'd taken only one thing, her leather notebook, filled with business contacts and financial records. Those contacts helped me uncover the truth about my inheritance, and they gave me the connections I needed to start my career in banking. Over the past decade, I'd worked my way up, building influence with every promotion, getting closer to this moment when Robert would walk into my office, desperate, unaware that I controlled his fate. "The company needs this loan," Robert said, voice rough. "Without it, we'll lose everything." "I see," I replied. "How fascinating. Does that feeling remind you of anything? Maybe a certain conversation we had 10 years ago?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Alexandra, whatever grievances you think you have." "Think I have?" I interrupted, pulling out another folder. "You mean like these bank records showing how you transferred my inheritance into offshore accounts? Or perhaps these documents proving that the will you presented was forged?" His face turned from pale to ghostly. "How did you get these?" "Let's just say, Mom always kept receipts." I tapped the leather notebook resting on my desk. "She also taught me how to play the long game." And what a game it had been. After Robert kicked me out, I spent months living with my best friend, Julie, working 2 jobs while gathering the evidence of his crimes. Instead of confronting him then, I waited, letting him grow complacent in his stolen wealth. I worked my way through college on scholarships and loans, climbing the banking ladder with laser focus. Each promotion was a step closer to this moment. "Your company needs $50 million to avoid bankruptcy," I said, glancing through his application. "Quite a sum. Tell me, how did Harrison Manufacturing end up in such dire straits?" He swallowed hard. "Market changes, unforeseen setbacks, poor management," I interjected, flipping through more pages. "Risky investments, failed expansions. Looks like the same reckless behavior that led you to steal from an 18-year-old girl has finally caught up with you." "I did what I had to do," he snapped, a flash of his old arrogance breaking through. "You were just a child, you would have wasted that money on frivolous." "On college?" I cut in. "On building a future, instead of gambling it away on failed ventures?" I pulled out more documents. "Did you really think I wouldn't discover how you squandered most of it within 2 years?" The silence that followed was thick, deafening. Outside, the usual hum of the bank's daily operations continued, oblivious to the drama unfolding in my office. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice barely audible. I smiled, leaning back in my chair. "What do I want? I'm simply doing my job, Robert, evaluating loan applications, assessing risk." I let the words linger. "Making decisions that affect people's lives." The next morning, I sat in the executive boardroom, Robert's loan application spread out before me. The other committee members filtered in and took their seats around the polished mahogany table. "The Harrison Manufacturing proposal," I began, "requires special consideration." What they didn't know was that I had spent the night not just reviewing his loan application, but also a decade's worth of Robert's disastrous decisions. Each failed venture, each desperate attempt to cover his losses, painted a picture of a man who had never learned from his mistakes. "The numbers are concerning," Janet, our risk analyst, pointed out. "Their debt-to-equity ratio is problematic," I agreed. "But there's more." I slid folders across the table, each one containing carefully curated data, enough to expose Robert's financial mismanagement without betraying my personal connection. I had spent years preparing for this moment, gathering evidence while staying in the shadows. My phone buzzed. A text from Julie. "He's in the lobby again. Looks desperate." Of course he was. After yesterday's meeting, Robert had likely spent a sleepless night realizing exactly who held his fate in their hands. The man who once told me I'd never amount to anything was now pacing the bank's lobby, waiting for my decision. "There's also the matter of their collateral," I continued, flipping to page 3. "The factory properties they're offering as security, they're not what they seem." The committee leaned in as I laid out my findings. The properties were heavily leveraged, their value inflated through creative accounting, the same kind of manipulation Robert had used to siphon away my inheritance. "Miss Chen," our chairman said, studying me. "Your diligence is commendable, but why such a deep investigation into this particular application?" I kept my expression unreadable. "Let's just say I have a special interest in making sure we don't back the wrong people." During lunch, I found Robert still in the lobby, looking like he had aged another decade overnight. "Any news?" he asked, scrambling to his feet as I passed. "The committee is still deliberating," I replied coolly. "Though I must say, those property valuations you provided, quite creative." His face fell. "Alexandra, please. The company employs hundreds of people. Their livelihoods matter to you now?" I cut him off. "Where was this concern when you left me with nothing?" He raked a shaking hand through his gray hair. "I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But this isn't about me anymore. Those families." I held up a hand. "Don't." My voice was quiet, firm. "You lost the right to manipulate me a long time ago." Back in the boardroom, the discussion leaned toward rejection. The numbers simply didn't justify the risk. But I had one last move to make. "I have a proposal," I said, sliding forward a final document. "A way to protect the bank's interests while ensuring the company survives." The terms were exacting. Majority control would shift to a board of our choosing. Robert would step down as CEO. A significant percentage of company profits would be placed in a trust for employees. "It's unconventional," the chairman admitted, skimming the terms. "But given the circumstances." By late afternoon, the decision was made. I had Robert brought into my office one last time. The final papers lay before him. "The committee has reached a decision," I said, watching his face as I outlined the terms. He would lose his company, but the employees, those he had used as bargaining chips, would be protected. It was more mercy than he had ever shown me. He stared at the papers, shoulders slumped. "Why?" he asked hoarsely. "Why not just ruin me completely?" I thought of the scared 18-year-old girl I had been. The one he left with nothing. The one who built everything in spite of him. "Because," I said quietly, "someone has to break the cycle." 2 months later, I stood in Harrison Manufacturing's main factory, watching the morning shift change. Workers streamed in, their jobs secure under new management. Robert's former office, once adorned with expensive artwork and empty accolades, had been repurposed into a training center for employee development. "Miss Chen?" Sarah, the new HR director, approached with a stack of files. "The employee trust documents are ready for your review." I nodded, taking them. The trust would ensure 30% of company profits went directly to employee benefits and profit sharing, something Robert had always dismissed as unnecessary. Now, it was the foundation of the company's future. The irony wasn't lost on me. His greed had ultimately led to his workers receiving more than he had ever given them. My phone buzzed. A text from Julie. "Have you seen the news?" I pulled up a local business journal's website. There it was, the headline I had been expecting. "Robert Harrison, former CEO of Harrison Manufacturing, files for personal bankruptcy." The article detailed how his personal assets, many purchased with my stolen inheritance, were being liquidated to pay his debts. The mansion, the cars, the vacation homes, all gone. He had finally learned what it felt like to lose everything. but as I walked through the factory floor, watching workers move with renewed energy and purpose, I realized something important. This was never just about revenge. It was about transformation. Alexandra. I turned to find Robert standing there, looking oddly small in his casual clothes. As part of the loan agreement, he had been allowed to stay on as a technical consultant. His engineering knowledge was still valuable, even if his business judgment wasn't. The employee training program you implemented, he said awkwardly, it's working better than I expected. People tend to surprise you when you invest in them instead of just using them, I replied. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the factory floor. Your mother, she tried to tell me that years ago, about investing in people. He hesitated. She would be proud of what you've done here. Not just here, I said, handing him a newspaper. Look at page 6. He opened it, eyes widening at the article about First National Bank's new scholarship program for disadvantaged youth, funded by the interest from his loan payments. His hands trembled slightly as he read. The money you stole from me, I said quietly. It was never just about the amount, it was about opportunity. Now, it's finally being used the way Mom intended, to give others the chances I almost lost. Later that day, as I gathered my things, I found an old photograph taped to my office door, Mom and me at my high school graduation, both of us beaming with hope for the future. Robert must have left it. On the back, he had written, I'm sorry, I know it's not enough, but I'm finally learning what Alexandra Stevens taught us both, that true success isn't about what you take, but what you give back. 1 year later, Harrison Manufacturing had become a model of corporate responsibility, the employee trust was thriving, profits were up, the training center had already launched careers for dozens of local youth. Robert remained in his consultant role, humbled, but slowly earning respect for his expertise rather than his title. He never regained his wealth or power, but in the end, he found something far more valuable, the appreciation of the people he had once exploited. As for me, I stayed at the bank, but my focus shifted. Instead of seeking retribution, I looked for companies on the brink, the ones with potential, the ones worth saving. Mom's old leather notebook still sat on my desk, its worn pages filled with business contacts and notes, but now, my own entries filled the margins. These days, when I opened it, I didn't see a record of past wrongs. I saw a blueprint for making things right. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. Sometimes, it's about building something better from the ruins of what they tried to take from you. And sometimes, the people who hurt you the most end up teaching you the most valuable lessons, not through their success, but through their failure. The inheritance Robert stole was meant to give me a future. In the end, it did, just not in the way anyone expected. Because true wealth isn't in what you own. It's in what you build. And what we built from the ashes of his greed was worth far more than what he had stolen.